Hey, if you'd like to earn CEUs for this webinar, join the Safeopedia community at the link in the description below. Now, on to the show.
So I'm Keith Elias. I'm the National Product Sales Manager for Honeywell Miller Fall Protection. Been with Miller about 21 years now and in the industry for just a little over 40 years. Live in the Carolinas. Actually started out on the road just calling on customers and doing different types of stuff, but now I get to work on the offering side a little bit and with new products and everything else. Bob?
And I'm Bob Weingren. I'm the Senior Fall Protection Sales Manager. I live in Pittsburgh. I cover Western PA and the state of Ohio. I've been with Miller I'm in year 32. So I've, like Keith, been involved in product development. Just to date myself a little bit, I field tested Duraflex in the late 90s. So on the screen, you can see 80 years, the logo. What a lot of people don't realize is that Miller's actually the oldest fall protection manufacturer in the world, and this is our 80th anniversary this year.
The screen sharing stopped for. Oh, there we go. Sorry, it was just on my screen. Sorry about that.
Okay, So we're good. All right, and as little Keith and I just mentioned who we are, and there's better photos of each of us. So what are we going to cover here in the next half hour or so? We're going to talk about specifically some standard changes that have happened most recent. So we're going to talk about the most recent OSHA standard change, the 1910 General Industry Standard that went into effect on January of 2017. And then also the newest standard change to ANSI that went into effect August 1st of last year, which affects retractables. And in particular with the OSHA standard, we're going to spend a little more time on that, why it changed, some of the highlights it changed from snap hook shrink, leading edges, ladders, and some of the dates. In particular, because I can't emphasize it enough, OSHA is the law. ANSI is not the law. So it's very important that you understand what do you need to do to be in compliance with the law. So having said that, why did it change? Well, it was in effect for basically 35 years. And during that time, there was a lot of data that was accumulated as far as injuries that were related to falls in general industry. And falls in particular were cited as a significant risk. And so because of that, OSHA decided that it was time to take a look at this. So why did they change? Well, they looked at the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and they took a 7-year window. And from that, they determined that there were 261 fatal falls on average that occurred annually just in general industry. Construction is significantly higher, but this is the general industry standard. 48,379 lost workdays annually as a result of falls. Slips, trips, and falls in the same level, 125,000 incidents occurred during that time frame. There was nearly 30 workplace fatalities and 6,000 lost workday injuries each year from falls, again, just in general industry. The general industry standard measures were determined because of the significance of the injuries and fatalities that were reviewed from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics information, that what was currently in place just wasn't adequate. It wasn't simple, it wasn't clear. A lot of companies weren't really in compliance, and a lot of times employers didn't even know what they really needed to do. So there were some changes made. to make it more clear for everyone. The new standard also incorporated some technical information from a variety of sources, from ANSI, National Fire Protection, International Code of Council, and all of these things were utilized to affect these changes. I mentioned earlier there's two regulations. There's OSHA, and in particular the general industry standard and what it is, and then there's ANSI. I cannot emphasize this enough. OSHA is the law. ANSI is not the law. It's a strong recommendation by safety professionals. The problem is people tend to confuse the two. And OSHA actually propagates that to a degree because they will use ANSI standards for enforcement where they don't have their own standards. I had a meeting last week, and we were talking about some of the new retractables. And the person I was talking to said, well, OSHA uses ANSI for enforcement. I gave an example. If anybody wears safety glasses, inside the safety glass, you'll see a little Z87. That is an ANSI standard. Why? Because OSHA does not have standards for safety glasses. So they will reference ANSI standards for enforcement for safety glasses. Hard hats, the same thing. But for fall protection, there are OSHA standards and there are ANSI standards. I have a lot of people say, well, we follow ANSI. That's fine. That's your prerogative. That is more stringent than OSHA. However, are you issuing fall protection equipment to individuals that weigh less than 130 pounds or more than 310 pounds? Because ANSI is very specific with this. You have to weigh between 130 and 310 pounds to use personal fall protection. If you're issuing it to people that are less than that or over that, you're not following ANSI. And I just want to make sure everyone understands that because I've gotten that question a lot, and that is a very vital component of it. So let's start with the OSHA standard. The original OSHA standard that had anything that was fall protection related was from 1971, the 1910.66 Powered Platform Standard. The reason it was put in this standard was because at that time, OSHA wanted to have a fall protection standard, and they got a lot of pushback. So in order to get something on the books, they incorporated into the Powered Platform Standard. So one of the key things that still hasn't changed to this day is for general industry, you need to use fall protection when your feet are 4 feet above a walking or working surface. Now, that hasn't changed. And at that point, guardrails were typically the primary method used. Personal fall protection was really not the primary driver because at that point, what was available to you? A safety belt and a rope. So that they didn't recognize it as a viable option because literally the technology that available at that time really wasn't great. So they used the general duty clause as the primary driver for personal fall protection. Now, if you're not familiar with the general duty clause, in a nutshell, it says that you as an employer, it is your obligation to provide the safest environment you can for your workers. Pretty broad statement, but that's kind of their safety net catch-all. And that was the primary driver behind the original general industry standard. So what changed? Well, they updated it to recognize the technology and advances that were made in the industry. Since this time, there's been shock-absorbing lanyards, retractable lifelines, harnesses, harness innovation, anchor points, just the technology's changed dramatically. This, again, addresses just general industry. It does not address construction. That is a separate standard. And it gives you greater flexibility to choose what is best for your particular scenario. There's not a one-size-fits-all. I do many walkthroughs, and I'll go to places, and people tend to look for the most technologically advanced solution, when quite honestly, some of the best answers are the simplest. And it does increase the consistency between the construction and general industry standard, primarily because when the construction standard went into effect in January of 1998, it was the first time that it required the use of a harness instead of a safety belt for fall arrest. It made a safety belt applicable for positioning only, not for fall arrest. The general industry standard, quite honestly, until this happened, didn't change that. However, the general duty clause, the industry recognizes that a harness is the better option than a belt. So in essence, safety belts were outlawed. So what are some of the highlights? Snap hook strength. So originally, standard snap hooks, a locking snap hook, it required a 220-pound front load on the front of the gate and a 350-pound side load on the gate. The meat of the hook, the top of the hook, was always for 5,000 pounds. What the standard has changed to, which is to mirror the ANSI standard that was put out in 2007, it requires a 3,600-pound gate strength on the front and the side. So the 220, 350 pounds is no more for general industry. This doesn't mean that you cannot use this. You still cannot use this snap hook any differently than you used the previous version. What this is just doing is upping the safety factor. It still has to be compatible. It doesn't mean you can just automatically choke things off or use rebar hooks in ways that they're not compatible with. You still have to use it the proper way. And training is necessary. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this a little bit further. So that's in a nutshell what changed with the snap hooks. Leading edges. Prior to this standard going into effect, there was no set distances that were given when you had to use some sort of fall protection when you were close enough to an unprotected leading edge. So you can imagine people were all over the board with this. That's what it really said. It was close enough to the edge to put you in a hazard. There was no distance. Now there is. There's 3 zones that are created. If you're 6 feet or closer to an unprotected leading edge, fall protection is required. That can be tied off. That can be a handrail. If you're 6 to 15 feet and you go there infrequently, we'll talk about what they deem as infrequent later, but basically daily, weekly, monthly, that's not infrequent. Once a year, twice a year, once a quarter, that could be infrequent. If you're 15 feet or further away from that unprotected edge, no fall protection is required. Now, what you got to remember is you could be 25 feet from the edge. You're in a protected zone. But let's say that you're going to remove an HVAC unit. As soon as you take the unit off the roof and you've created a hole in the roof, you are now 6 feet or closer to that unprotected edge. Now you have to be using fall protection. Even though you're 30 feet from the edge of the roof, you're now within 6 feet of this unprotected edge. Low slope roofs. Again, that's where you're primarily going to see this. What is a low slope roof? It's a 412 pitch. So if you're not sure what that means, is that if you were to take a vertical line and you went 12 inches out, and you measure down at a diagonal to create a triangle, and it's 4 inches down. So if you went 4 inches on the vertical, 12 inches out perpendicular to 90, and you measured that angle back, so you complete the triangle, that's a 412. So if you want to get a visual for what that is. But basically a 412, for all intents and purposes, is basically considered a flat roof. And then we'll talk about these in a couple slides here as far as those different zones. So there's 3 zones. As I mentioned, zone 1 is less than 6 feet from the roof edge, zone 2 is 6 to 15 feet, and zone 3 is 15 feet or further. And you can see the diagram. It shows some various examples. There are handrail options that are freestanding handrails. You don't even have to make a roof penetration. You can use weighted bases, and they sit on the roof. So you're not going to avoid any kind of roof warranty or worry about puncturing a membrane and creating a leak scenario. One of the things that I really like about this diagram on the left, I've been on a number of roofs. People have said, we have to hand row in a 7,000 square foot roof. But they have one HVAC unit that's 5 feet from one edge. And your access is in the middle of the roof. How in the world do you justify doing that? If you use this freestanding handrail and you put it on the back side of that HVAC unit and your path walks you toward it, you are in a protected zone. You don't need to handrail your whole roof. If you have units all over the roof, then you would. But the handrail is a very effective means of doing this. So here's a good example. You've got 2 workers here. One is in this protected zone. Again, the weighted base handrail, they're here. This one, there is no handrail over there. Notice an anchor point was created in zone 3, which is outside of the 15-foot zone. They tied to it, walked into the zone, did what they need to. While they're tied off, they would walk back, disconnect. They're in the protected zone. So there's different ways to address this, but one of these 2 ways is what you would have to do. As far as zone 2 goes, the infrequent, this zone has to be designated, clearly marked with some sort of a warning system. I have had people that have literally put flags up at 6 feet that are red, and at 15 feet they'll put yellow flags. So you have to be infrequent that you would go there. Only certain people could go into that zone, and when they're in that zone, they have to have a safety monitor. So again, you can see from the diagram here on the left, the person on the upper part of the picture is in the zone, kneeling down, they're doing their work, they're not tied off. The other person went through the zone into zone 1. So as soon as they cross that threshold, now the handrail's over here, there's no handrail, they had to tie off to go into that area. Zone 3, as I mentioned earlier, is 15 feet or further from the edge. Again, if you created an unprotected edge in that zone and you're within 6 feet of it, it now becomes zone 1. So this whole standard change, in a nutshell, is OSHA's not expecting you or asking you to spend $1 million to address all the roofs. What they're saying is, if you open your eyes to what is up there and utilize it and you work smarter, not only are you going to be safer, but you can be in compliance. One of the things that I have many times when I've walked on roofs, they're going to an HVAC unit that's 5 feet from an edge. But in the middle of the roof, 20 feet away, is this massive air handler. Now, if you have something that's very large on the roof, it's just not sitting on the sheeting of the roof. Their structure that was created that it sits on is tied to the structure of the building. If it's that big, it's going to have some sort of lifting point on it. More than likely, down low, where the structure is that it's sitting on. You don't have to put a hole in your roof. Put an anchorage point connector of some sort on the structure it's sitting on, tie to that, then walk into the zone. It's a very inexpensive way of doing it. You're utilizing existing structure that's exposed up there. You're not voiding any roof warranties. So this was arguably the biggest change that was made addressing these unprotected leading edges. And again, the infrequent, and I mentioned it earlier what it is, and they're talking about some different things, replacing filters, batteries, that sort of thing. I'm not going to read this, but you can read through it. But I think you get the gist of what we're talking about here. What would be infrequent versus non-infrequent. The second change was fixed vertical ladders. Now, in the past, if you had a fixed vertical ladder that was 24 feet or higher, you had to use some sort of fall protection. Now, the most frequent form of fall protection was a cage ladder. What a lot of people don't realize, that a cage ladder was not created as fall protection. A cage ladder was created to give you something to lean against to rest as you climb the ladder. Over time, it evolved into fall protection. And the thinking was, well, if you fall, you stick your arm or leg out and stop yourself. Well, reality of it is, if you fell into a cage ladder, it's going to beat you up pretty good, but they're going to know where to find you because you're going to be at the bottom. It was never intended for that. So this standard has now, it hasn't outlawed a cage. That is also something I hear a lot. I got to remove all my cages. No, you don't. All this standard is doing is it's reverting the cage back to what its original intent was. A resting point, something to lean against. You do not have to remove your cage ladders, but it can no longer be your primary means of fall protection anymore. So now you're going to have three options. Either a rigid rail system, a cable system, or the anchor bracket combo. So what the standard says, you have to use some sort of a system or fall protection. So the rigid rail and the cable are systems. So what is a system? Well, a system is a positioning application. So in other words, OSHA defines positioning as you're 9 inches or closer to what you're tied to. And if you fall, you have to arrest your fall within 2 feet. So you attach to these systems using some sort of a shuttle and a front D-ring on your harness. You're within the 9 inches. You're climbing up. The shuttle's down at waist level, about your belt buckle level. If you fell, you go past it. The brake engages, you stop. You're within 9 inches. Your fall's arrested within 2 feet. You are considered, those are positioning systems. The cable system is the one that I get asked most frequently about. Quite honestly, cable systems are the least expensive one. I just got a knee-jerk reaction, put a cable up. If it is a ladder that is outside, that's exposed to the elements, I personally would not recommend putting a cable on an outside ladder. I would use one of the rigid rail systems. Because if you have a cable outside and you get temperature changes, that cable's going to expand and contract. It's going to be very difficult to keep the tension in the cable. I have seen wind wear out cables, just whipping it around. If it's inside, out of the elements, temperature controlled environment, put a cable up. If it's outside, you use a rigid rail, the elements aren't going to affect it, the temperature change aren't going to affect it. In my opinion, that is a better option to put outside. Now, a couple things you have to be aware of. If you're going to use either one of those systems, you need two things to use it. you need a shuttle, and you need a harness with a front D-ring. So let's talk about a real world scenario. You have ladders with these systems on it. Somebody walks up, they have to climb the ladder. Do they have the right harness? Maybe, maybe not. Are they going to take the time to find that harness? Maybe, maybe not. Where's the shuttle? I don't know. What do you think people are really going to do? They're going to look left, right, nobody's looking. They're going to climb the ladder, and you're going to avoid the whole reason why you have it in the first place. The third option, this anchor bracket SRD combo, remember I said that you have two options, a system or fall protection? That is a fall protection option. That bracket at the top is creating an anchor point on the rungs of the ladder itself. From that, you would hang a retractable with a tag line. So now you walk over to this ladder, you pull the tag line down. Any harness, as long as it has a back D-ring. You're going to use this like any other fixed retractable would use in your facility. You pull it down, you hook it to you, you climb up the ladder. It's an anchor point. So say you go to the top of this, you walk through a swing gate. We have a version that's 10 foot, so you would hang 7 feet, attaches to the top 3 rungs of the ladder. You're attached, you walk through the gate, you close the gate, let it hang there. Do what you need to, come back, hook to it, open the gate. Your transition on and off the ladder is not an issue anymore. You get to the bottom, take it off, put the tag line on, send it back up. So these are your 3 options. So just wanted to review those so everybody realizes what's going to be required. Now, if you're not sure which system you want to do, there's actually an evaluation template that's available. And it basically shows the 3 types of ladders that you could use. You're going to either climb one and you're going to exit the ladder left or right. It's a step-through ladder, or one that say there's a hatch to enter a roof. And it's basically showing you if you're going to use either the rigid rail system or the cable system, where you would want to put them on each one of these options. If you're going to step left or right, put it down the middle of the ladder, terminate at the top rung. If you're going to go step through the ladder, probably a gate, you're going to want to move it to one side because and it's going to extend up. Because if it's terminated here, the biggest problem is the getting on and off the ladder. If it's at foot level, you have to disconnect while you're on the ladder. If you go up, you can go through a swing gate connected to it and disconnect. Hatch, same way. You're going to go here, pop the hatch. We're working on an extension that could come up, or create an anchor point that you would hook to with a small retractable to let you transition out. But I wanted to make sure that you understand there's templates available for site visits that you can look at to determine what's best for your particular solution or situation. Also, part of this standard change is training. Now, it's required that you train people that are going to be using fall protection. It's required. The training is important. Retraining is when you deem it's necessary. If you've got a lot of new hires, people that haven't seen it for a while, but it is required. Anybody using personal fall protection, ladders, any of the ladder systems, ladders in general, whether it be step ladder, extension ladder, and specifically the training has to be geared toward recognizing what is a fall hazard in your particular facility, know what you're supposed to do in those areas, and then in particular, if you're going to use personal fall protection, how to use it. So some of the highlights of the training. This is why they included the training portion of this. These are some of my favorite photographs. People that obviously needed the training. The one in particular is the one that kind of gets me. Is this must be some sort of a sack that they sell, because the guys literally picked up he's in a sack from a jib crane welding. This is why they included the training portion of this. Some of the particular dates, a lot of these have passed already, but and I'll show you on the next slide, but it's giving you time to get familiar with what's required, evaluate any changes that you need to be made, lets you plan. In particular, I'll show you on the next one, the deadline for all fixed ladders is November 18th of 2036, which seems like a long way off. But by doing that, you don't have to necessarily look at having to do a capital expenditure to address 100 ladders. What would be the best option would be to start looking at them now, address the ladders now that you're using on a regular basis, and systematically work through it. Then that way you're going to be in compliance before the date and you don't have to deal with the capital expenditure. Most of the dates have passed already, but you can see the last deadline is November 18th, 2036 for all the ladders. ANSI. We're going to talk about these changes that happen in particular, and they involve retractables. Now, one of the things that I cannot stress enough about this, the standard does not affect anybody that's using equipment that was made before August 1st of last year. The standard changes affects us as a manufacturer. We cannot claim that our products meet the ANSI standard unless we as a manufacturer have made the changes required. So in the past, you may have seen things that were classification A or B. Now it's 1 or 2. Specific labeling changes. When it's a class 1, it has to be a white background with black font. Class 2 is the opposite, black background with a white font. Very specific in the size and the placement it has to be. It doesn't mean that anything that was made prior to that you're using is no longer in compliance. It is in compliance. Even us as a manufacturer, we could have made something on July 30th of last year. You could have bought it. You could buy it today. It's still in compliance. That date only affects us being able to do this. Now, there were some specific things that this related to, specifically some tie-off points, the new label requirements we talked about. I mentioned that we as a manufacturer can't make it, not meet these standards currently now. But one thing I also wanted to make sure you understand, I had mentioned earlier about the weight ratings, 130 to 310 pounds per OSHA. Using the ANSI testing, heavier weights, longer drops, all of the testing criteria that they give, all of our products meet the new ANSI standard. If you take that exact same product and you change the testing requirements to the OSHA testing requirements, that all of our retractables now are 420 pound rated. Our harnesses have all been 420 pounds for the last 8 years. Now all the retractables are. So the color schemes match. Keith mentioned that in the product showcase earlier, kind of the Garanimals effect. If they look like they belong together, they belong together because they're not only compatible from a connection standpoint and a usage standpoint, but also a user weight standpoint. But again, if you are following ANSI and you're issuing it to someone that weighs less than 130 pounds or more than 310 pounds, you're not following ANSI. Anchor points. A couple key things about this.
Bob, I just wanted to do a quick time check. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
There's a few questions as well. They can be answered after the presentation by you or Keith, but just a quick check there.
Appreciate that. So in a nutshell with the anchor points, if you have a permanent anchor point, you have to have a a PE certify it that it's okay to put it to use. If it's temporary, you have to have a qualified person deem that, yeah, you can put a cross arm strap around it. Basically, a structure member building is going to be an acceptable temporary anchor point. The old retractables, you can see there's a whole portfolio all over the map. Now they're all conducive in color, weight standpoints. They meet their new standards. Different classifications, again, class 1, in a nutshell, what that means is you're tied off a D-ring or above. Class 2 means above or down to foot level. I will also mention this. OSHA does not recognize class 1 or 2. Only ANSI does. So, quick review. Talked about the standard, the OSHA standard, general industry standard. Why it changed? Basically, it was antiquated. Technologies changed. It was time to make a change. Snap hook strength, 220-pound gates to a 3,600-pound gate. Leading edges, the 3 zones. 6 feet or closer, you have to use fall protection. 6 to 15 feet, infrequent, controlled access zone. 15 feet or further, no fall protection is required. Ladders, fixed vertical ladders. Rigid rail, cable are systems. The ladder davit is a fall protection option in the dates. And with the self-retracting devices, we talked about it, what we as a manufacturer have to do to meet that standard. And you can see what we've done. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.